Throughout the year 1432, an enormous dragon lumbered its way from Burley Beacon into the surrounding villages, there to ravish and devour any passing maidens, passing youths, hobbling grandmothers, waddling grandfathers, small children, goats, sheep, cattle, horses, dogs, even the occasional cat when it was particularly hungry. It would devour them one after the other, and at the end of each session of gorging itself, it would flap its enormous wings and fly off back to Burnley Beacon, there to park its backside upon the top of the mound. And the people of the surrounding village, they wept, they wailed, they tore their hair out in frustration, they turned to one source of help after another. All of the big lads from the local farms went up, armed with sharpened pikes, with axes and adzes and any kind of weapon they could lay hands to from their farming trades, and did battle with the dragon. And not one of them came back. Each and every one disappeared down the dragon's gullet. And then the villagers turned to the local clergy in the hope that they would be able to conduct exorcisms and recite Bible verses and dispel the dragon back to the bowels of hell from which it came. And a selection of reverend gentlemen and the occasional monk went up to the top of the hill, and they began to recite psalms, and they recited Bible verses of one sort and another, and not one of them came back, each and every single one disappearing down the gullet of the great dragon. And at length, word came to the local aristocracy of all that was happening in the land, not only of the ravishings of the dragons, but of the failed attempts to get rid of the dragon. And one Sir Maurice Berkeley, lord of the manor, decided that he would don his best armour, take out his grandfather's sword and his father's pike and any other equipment he could lay hands to, and lay in wait for the dragon. Now, one of the dragon's favourite places to come and ravish was a local hill not far from where Sir Maurice Berkeley lived. And so Sir Maurice had his servants build him a simple lean-to, a shack, a hut in which he could hide away and spy on the dragon, wait for it to come, its great leathery wings beating, causing the branches of the trees to sway and creak and groan in the winds whipped up by its enormous wings, and its great slithering tail that wrapped around everything that it came upon. 3 days and 3 nights Sir Maurice Berkeley waited in that humble hut, before, on the 3rd night, the great dragon came. Now, along with his armaments, Sir Maurice had taken with him his 2 favourite hounds, great beasts of slavering fang, normally, of course, quite friendly lapdogs, but when their mood was up, they were fearsome beasts to behold. And it was the dogs, with their whimpering and their whining, that first signalled the coming of the dragon before Sir Maurice himself could hear the beating of the wings approaching, because of course dogs have so much better hearing than mere humans. And so Sir Maurice was up and ready and armed, waiting for the arrival of the beast, and there it came with a great thump onto the hilltop, roaring and raging, and at once the dogs were out quicker than Sir Maurice himself could put foot, one in front of the other, and he joined his dogs, the dogs setting about the beast, biting at the tail, biting at the hind legs, while Sir Maurice hacked and slashed with his sword at the front of the dragon. Round and round and round they went, biting and slashing and tearing. One dog was thrown, whimpering and howling, head over heels, down to the base of the hill, where it landed with a terrible crunch and lay still. The other dog continued to bite and rip and tear and howl and savage at the dragon, and Sir Maurice continued to slash and hack, although he took blow after blow, breaking off great lumps of armour, leaving him with blood gouting from his wounds. And then the other dog was slashed with a great claw, its innards splattering across the hillside, and the poor thing lay there dead at Sir Maurice's feet. On and on the battle raged. Hour after hour. People came from far and wide, hearing the howls and the roars and the thundering, hearing the shaking of the very earth beneath their feet. Until at length, by the noon hour, bearing in mind the dragon had arrived in the hours of darkness, Sir Maurice dealt the final blow, ramming his sword home into the chest of the dragon, piercing its mighty heart. And the dragon flattened, flew away, the sword embedded in it, its roars becoming weaker and weaker and weaker until they watched it come to earth a couple of miles away. And there it lay upon the ground and breathed its last, as its life's blood seeped into the soil. A great cheer, a great roar went up from the crowd. And Sir Maurice called for his horse, called for his servants, and they helped him onto the horse, and he rode off in the direction of where the dragon had gone, wanting partly to retrieve his sword and partly to make sure that dragon was most assuredly dead. And when at length, following the trail of broken treetops where the mighty swinging tail of the dragon had taken off branches here and branches there, following the splatter of blood that had fallen from the many wounds inflicted on the dragon's hide, he came at length to a clearing where there were broken trees from where the dragon had crashed to earth, and there was the dragon itself, the sword still embedded in it. And Sir Maurice heaved out the sword, and even as he did so, he saw that enormous, leathery, reptilian beast shifting and turning and changing in its death, its body growing colder and colder, greener and greener, and it had always been quite a vivid shade of green upon the scales of its back, but now that vivid green was becoming more like grass. And even as Sir Maurice watched, the beast turned into a mound of earth covered in grass, and in due course in flowers. For Sir Maurice visited that hillside each day, and the local people referred to it in due time as Bolton's Bench, though to begin with as the Dragon's Hill. For 30 days, Sir Maurice, despite all of the many wounds on his own body, would clamber out of his bed, aching and throbbing, the many bandages wrapped around him by his physicians, and ignoring the physician's advice to get bed rest, he would clamber out, stagger downstairs, call for his horse, roaring and thundering at his servants when they were reluctant to bring him the horse, preferring him to follow the doctor's advice, but he would insist that they brought him the horse so he could get on the back and ride out to the hill that had once been a dragon, and look upon it and make sure the dragon was not merely sleeping or playing some trick upon him, but was genuinely dead and gone. And over the course of those 30 days, he saw flowers begin to grow up on the hillside. He saw the emergent saplings grow up on the hillside of trees that were yet to come. And each day he went back to the hill, he would go armed with sword, with pike, with bow, just in case that dragon should spring back to life. And each afternoon when he arrived back at his manor house, blood would be seeping through the bandages about his chest, his stomach, his arms, his legs, his head. And the physicians were called time after time, and again they told him, ordered him, that he must get bed rest. But again, day after day, he would ignore them and go riding out. And so he became weaker and weaker and weaker, And towards the end of those 30 days, the delirium began to set in. He began to rant and rave about hearing the beating of the dragon's wings, about hearing the roaring of the dragon in the distance, and the servants would all assure him that they could hear no such thing, but he could hear it. The dragon haunted him in its death far more vividly, far more terrifyingly than it had done in its life. And on the 30th day, after the death of the dragon, when he rode out to the hillside, armed with sword and spear and lance and bow and dagger and anything else he could find to take with him as a weapon, he climbed on to the top of that mound, roaring and shouting to the skies about the dragon that would beset him, and all that he would do. The sword slipped from his hand. The lance that was still attached to the saddle of the horse fell to the earth. The longbow that he carried clattered to the ground. And then he himself, raving and roaring that the dragon was coming for him, fell to earth and lay still and dead upon the mound. And the servant that had rode out with him watched all of this and rushed about trying to revive his master, pushing wine upon his lips to no effect, trying to rub his chest in the hope of massaging his heart back into life to no effect. Until at length he had to face the fact that his master was cold and dead. And that poor benighted servant picked up his master's sword, picked up his master's shield, picked up his master's lance and spear, tied them all onto the horse saddle, then managed to drag his master from the top of the hill to the base and put his body over the saddle of the horse, that he might lead both his own horse and that horse gently, slow, funereal pace back to the manor house. The only thing the servant had left behind in his worry and concern about looking after his master was the great longbow itself. And that new bow had embedded itself in the fresh soil of the fresh hill. And when at length, some days later, the servants, having prepared for all of the funeral services and ceremonies, began compiling lists of the inheritances that were passed to Sir Maurice's next of kin, realised that the long bow was missing, and they recollected that the bow was something which their late master had taken with him on his visits to the Dragon Mound. And one of the servants was sent out to try and find the bow. When he arrived, it was to his astonishment that the bow was not merely poked into the soil at the top of the hill, but was sprouting green shoots, putting out roots, despite being a seemingly dead piece of wood. The tree was alive. The bow was indeed now a tree. And from that day to this very day, yew trees, all of them descendants of the very first yew tree to grow upon that hill, sprouted from the longbow, grow still upon Bolton's bench. And to this day the dragon, if he be alive beneath the hill, has yet to awake, but perhaps one day he will do so.